My name is Mai Tran. The night my grandmother's will was read, my brother took the house, the money, and the last illusion I had, that I still belonged to my own family. I was 25. I was the granddaughter who had spent nights in hospital chairs. I knew which tea my grandmother could still swallow when everything else made her sick. I could read her face well enough to tell when she was in pain before she said a word. My brother Hoang was 30. Loud, adored, and permanently forgiven. That afternoon he got everything. I got an old coat. And the biggest thing I lost was not the money. It was the last part of me that still wanted to believe my parents would ever choose me when it cost them something. What they did not know standing there in that room while I held that coat and tried not to fall apart was this. My grandmother had not abandoned me. She had baited them. And the coat they laughed at was the one thing in that house that could ruin every lie they had built their lives on. The will reading happened in my parents' living room just a few hours after the last relatives had left from the funeral. The flowers were still there. The air still smelled like incense coffee, and the kind of fake grief people wear when death has already started looking like paperwork. The lawyer sat on the edge of the sofa with a folder in his lap. My mother had already moved into the version of widowhood by association she liked best. The one where she sighed a lot, and let people believe she had carried more than she had. My father stood near the window with his auntie. My father stood near the window. He looked impatient, like this was just one more task before dinner. And Hoang, my brother, my parents' golden son, the family's permanent excuse machine, was smiling before the lawyer even opened the folder. That should have told me everything. But grief makes you stupid in small ways. It makes you hope against evidence. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. The house would pass to Hoang. The primary accounts, the investments, the liquid assets my grandmother had spent decades protecting, would pass to Hoang. The family altar room, and the old furniture would remain attached to the property and transfer with the house. He read line after line, and every line sounded like a door shutting. Then he reached my name. I remember holding my breath. I remember thinking maybe Grandma had left me something private, not even money, just something that said I had not imagined the way she used to look at me when no one else was paying attention. Something that proved the last few months of distance had not meant what they seemed to mean. The lawyer looked down. To my granddaughter Mai, he read carefully, I leave my brown wool coat. That was it. Just the coat. For a second nobody said anything. Even the room seemed confused. Then Hoang laughed. Not a soft laugh. Not uncomfortable surprise. A mean, clean laugh. The kind that comes from someone who has wanted to humiliate you for a long time and has finally been handed a stage. He leaned back in his chair, looked right at me and said, See, I told you. At the end of the day a daughter is just extra weight. That old coat is already more than you earned. My mother did not tell him to stop. My father did not look ashamed. My mother actually shook her head at me like I was the one making the room unpleasant just by still standing in it. Then she said, Mai, don't start. Your grandmother made her choices. Your grandmother made her choices. As if I had not spent the last year driving Grandma to appointments. As if I had not slept in hard chairs next to her hospital bed. As if I had not changed schedules, skipped pay and swallowed my own life in pieces to make sure she was not alone when everybody else was busy. Kwang got up and walked toward the hallway like he already owned the house. He probably thought he did. My father glanced at me and said, Take the coat and go home. There's no point dragging this out. Go home. That was the cruel part. I did not have a home that felt like mine anymore. If you have ever been the child your own family found easiest to dismiss, stay with me. What they called my grandmother's last insult became the one thing that told the truth. I picked up the coat because I did not know what else to do. It was heavier than I expected. Brown wool. Old-fashioned cut. Not stylish. Not sentimental looking. Nothing dramatic about it. Just a coat my grandmother used to wear in cold weather, when she still insisted on handling errands herself. Huang looked at it in my arms and smirked. Don't forget to say thank you. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. His expensive watch. His perfect posture. The smug ease that comes from never paying for the damage you cause. The face my parents had protected since childhood. The face the whole family kept translating as promise no matter how many times reality disagreed. I wanted to say something sharp. I wanted to wound him. Instead, I heard myself ask. That's all she wanted me to have. The lawyer shifted. He did not answer right away. That silence stayed with me later after everything. My mother stepped in before he could speak. Don't embarrass yourself. You were there because you had time. Don't turn caregiving into a transaction. That line would have landed harder if Hoang had ever cared for anyone besides himself. But this was how it always worked in my family. When I gave, it was duty. When Hoang took, it was destiny. I put the coat over my arm and walked toward the front door. Nobody stopped me. Not my father. Not my mother. Not even the lawyer. At the door I turned once. Not because I expected regret. I think some part of me just wanted to memorize them exactly as they were in that moment. My brother already rearranging his future in his head. My mother looking relieved that the ugly part was over. My father refusing eye contact because if he looked at me too long he might have to admit, this was not fairness, it was preference. It had always been preference. Then I left, the door shut behind me like I had never lived there. I drove back to my apartment with the coat in the passenger seat. It was a one-bedroom rental over a nail salon in a strip mall 20 minutes away. The place always smelled faintly like acetone and someone else's laundry. I had been telling myself it was temporary for 3 years. That night it looked exactly how I felt. Small, tired, and good enough for one person who had learned not to take up much space. I put the coat on the kitchen table and stood there staring at it. I should tell you this because it matters. The money was not the only thing that hurt. What hurt was that I had spent the last year watching my grandmother slip away, and in her final months she had started treating me differently. Shorter, colder, sometimes almost dismissive when other people were around. I told myself she was tired, confused, angry at her own body, but I had still felt it. I had still gone home some nights and cried in the shower because the one person who had ever made me feel seen suddenly looked at me like I was a stranger. And now there was the will. The house to Hoang. Everything to Hoang. The coat to me. That was the part that broke something. Not because of the price tag. Because it seemed to confirm my worst fear. That in the end even the person who knew me best had decided I was easier to leave with almost nothing. I sat on the floor with my back against the kitchen cabinets and cried harder than I had at the funeral. Not graceful crying. Not movie crying. The kind that leaves your face hot and your chest aching, and makes you feel embarrassed even when nobody is there to see it. I do not know how long I stayed like that. Long enough for the room to go dark. Long enough for anger to start showing up underneath the grief. Long enough to notice when I finally pulled the coat into my lap, that one part of the lining felt wrong. At first, I thought it was just bunched fabric. Then I ran my fingers over it again. There was a seam inside the left panel that did not match the rest. Small hand stitching. Uneven. Recent maybe, or at least newer than the coat itself. I stopped crying. That was the first shift. Not hope, exactly. Just interruption. And sometimes, when your life is about to split in half, interruption is enough. I need to tell you how my family worked, or none of what happened next will make sense. I grew up in a house where my brother was treated like a future, and I was treated like extra labor. Nobody ever said it that clearly. Families like mine almost never do. They hide inside softer language. Hoang was strong-minded. I was too sensitive. Hoang was born for bigger things. I was good with helping. Hoang got another chance. I was told to be mature. That is how it starts. Not with one giant act of cruelty. With years of language that builds a staircase under one child, and a cage around the other. When we were kids, Hoang broke things, and I cleaned them up. He forgot assignments, and my mother blamed his teachers. I got straight A's, and my father said, "That's expected. Girls are supposed to be more disciplined." Hoang came home late and it meant he was social. I came home late and it meant I was careless. He got new shoes because boys need confidence. I got hand-me-downs because I was not the one carrying the family name. The worst part was not even the favoritism. It was the mythology around it. My parents truly believed they were being rational. In their minds, Hoang mattered more because the world would make room for him if he had enough backing. I mattered less because they assumed I would survive on less. That was their twisted compliment to me. They called it strength every time they used it to excuse neglect. My grandmother was the only person in that house who never lied to me with kind language. She never sat me down and said your parents are wrong. She was too practical for speeches like that. Instead, she did something more valuable. She paid attention. She noticed who was always asked to give in. She noticed who got thanked and who got used. She noticed that when Hoang wanted something, the whole house adjusted. When I needed something, I was told to wait. She never made a dramatic show of defending me in front of my parents, and when I was younger that hurt. I used to think she should have fought harder. Later I understood what she saw before I did. In families like mine, open rebellion gets assigned to the wrong person. If she challenged my parents too directly, they would punish me after she left the room. Not because I had done anything wrong. Because somebody had to carry the cost of discomfort, and in our house that was usually me. So Grandma built a private language instead. She taught me things. Real things. How to read a bank statement. How to compare signatures. How to make copies of anything important. How to keep cash hidden in places nobody thinks to check. How to listen longer than other people can pretend. How to fix clothes well enough that no one sees where the seam was torn. How to tell the difference between guilt and manipulation. How to leave a room without apologizing for it. She used to say, people show you who they are when they think you can't do anything with the information. I did not understand how much she meant that until much later. By the time I was in college, Hoang had already become the family's permanent investment project. He had business ideas every year, a cafe with friends, an import company, a sports merchandise site, a sneaker resale operation, then some vague tech thing he explained like a man who had memorized buzzwords and confused that with competence. Every failure was somebody else's fault. Bad timing, bad partners, bad economy, people jealous of his ambition. My parents believed him every single time. Not because his explanations were good, because believing him preserved the story they had chosen about him. It is hard to admit you built your whole family structure around the wrong child. So most parents like mine do not admit it. They double down. By then, I was already working part-time, paying my own rent in pieces, and learning how to ask for almost nothing. Because asking and being denied takes more energy than just doing without. Still, I stayed close to Grandma. Some of my clearest memories of adulthood are small ones with her. Taking her grocery shopping, sitting on her bed while she folded scarves, listening to her complain about rising prices like the country had personally betrayed her, watching old movies she pretended to hate, but always cried during. She had a dry way of loving people, not warm in public, not sentimental, but exact. If she handed you cut fruit, it meant she had been thinking about whether you were eating enough. If she mended a button on your coat without mentioning it, it meant she had noticed you were stretched thin. If she called to ask where you were at 10:30, it meant she had already stayed awake too long waiting. When her health started slipping, everyone performed concern in ways that looked good and cost little. My mother posted filtered photos with captions about sacrifice. My father told relatives he was handling everything. Ho Wang visited just enough to stay visible. I was the one who knew which pharmacy had her medication in stock when the regular place ran out. I was the one who knew the name of the nurse she liked, and the one she did not trust. I was the one who learned to read the sound of her breathing through a hospital monitor. I was there because I loved her. That is true. I was also there because I knew what would happen if nobody competent stayed. Families like mine are full of people who think showing up for the sad photo is the same thing as carrying the hard hour after. For a while, Grandma was herself. We still had our quiet moments. She still squeezed my hand when I helped her sit up. She still corrected my posture when I slouched in hospital chairs. She still asked whether I was keeping copies of my pay stubs, which was such a deeply her question that even then I had to laugh. Then in the last few months something changed. Not all at once. That would have been easier. It came in pieces. A shorter answer here. A sharper tone there. One day I brought soup, and she said without even looking at me, "Leave it. I'm not hungry." Another time I tried to adjust her blanket, and she pulled it back herself. The first time it happened in front of my mother gave me this look that almost felt satisfied. Like the universe had finally corrected itself and placed me where I belonged. I told myself Grandma was tired. Sick people get irritable. Pain changes how love sounds. But then it kept happening. And it always seemed worse when someone else was in the room. Once, after I spent an hour arguing with the billing office on the phone because they had coded one of her treatments wrong, I walked back into her room expecting maybe a small nod, maybe nothing at all. Instead, she said very flatly, "You don't need to act like you're the only one who cares." My mother was standing by the window when she said it. I remember the heat that rushed into my face. I remember saying I didn't say that. And Grandma looked away. I sat in my car after that visit and cried so hard I had to wait 20 minutes before driving home. That became the worst part of those last months. Not the hospital, not the paperwork, not the smell of sickness, the confusion, the feeling that the one place I had always been safe was shifting under my feet, and I did not know whether to blame illness, resentment, or myself, and still there were moments that did not fit. That is what kept bothering me. Once, after snapping at me in front of Hoang, she caught my eye for just half a second when he turned away. The look was too sharp, too awake, not apologetic exactly, more like warning. Another time she asked out of nowhere whether I still kept copies of everything important. I said yes. She nodded once and said, "Good." That was all. A week later, she asked if I remembered the name of the old bank branch she used years ago. I did. She made me repeat it anyway. I asked why. She said, "Because memory is cheaper than regret." Again, that was all. One afternoon I was in the hallway outside her room, and heard Hoang inside with her. His voice was low, irritated, not the warm, fake voice he used in front of relatives. I could not make out every word, but I heard timing and paperwork, and "don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then a nurse came out of the room and almost bumped into me. She looked uncomfortable. She did not say anything, but the expression stayed with me. It was the face of someone who had seen something ugly and did not know whether it was their place to name it. A few days before she died, Grandma had her coat folded near the bed. That coat. The same one I left the house with. It was not even cold. I remember picking it up and saying, "Why do you want this here?" She took it from me, held it against herself for a second, and said, "People throw things away too fast." Then she looked directly at me and added, "Sometimes the only honest thing left is the thing everybody else thinks is useless." I thought she was talking about aging. Or memory. Or herself. That sentence came back to me in my apartment, with the coat in my lap, and the uneven stitches under my fingertips. I stood up so fast my chair scraped across the kitchen tile. I got my sewing kit and a small pair of scissors. My hands were shaking again, but differently now. Not the helpless shake from earlier. Something tighter, more focused. I slid the tip of the scissors under the thread, and snipped carefully. One stitch, then another. The lining loosened. Inside was a flat envelope wrapped in plastic, and taped beneath it a small brass key. For a second I just stared. Then I pulled the envelope free, and saw my name on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. My. No one had written my name like that in months without making it sound like a burden. I sat down at the table and opened the letter. "My sweet girl, if you are reading this, then it means they did exactly what I expected them to do." The first line alone was enough to stop my breathing. I kept reading. She wrote that she had not forgotten me, had not stopped loving me, had not been confused about who had truly cared for her. She wrote that the coldness of her last months was deliberate, and broke her own heart, but she believed she had to make Hoang feel safe, make him arrogant, make him think he had already won. She wrote that he had been pressuring her for months, watching visitors, asking about accounts, trying to rush papers, testing whether she was still strong enough to resist him. She wrote that if she left anything obvious to me in public, he would go after it immediately. Worse, he might go after me. So she made a different choice. She gave him bait. She gave me the truth. There was another paragraph I had to read 3 times because my eyes kept blurring. The money everyone believed belonged to her outright, did not in the final sense belong to her at all. My grandfather had structured part of the estate years earlier in a way that passed stewardship through Grandma but preserved ultimate beneficial ownership for me once I turned 25. Grandma had spent years protecting it, growing it, and keeping it out of reach of people who would waste it, including her own son, including my brother. She wrote that the public will was never the full story. She wrote that the key opened the safe deposit box containing what I would need. She wrote in one line so sharp I can still hear it in her voice. "Never fight greed too early. Let it walk into the light first. At the bottom she added, I am sorry for every time I had to let you think I had turned away. I trusted you with the pain because I trusted you with the truth. That was the second time I cried that night. But those tears were different, not softer, not prettier, angrier. Because in that one letter I understood two things at once. My grandmother had never abandoned me. And whatever Hoang had done to make her write a letter, like that had been worse than I had let myself imagine. The next morning, I called in sick to work, took the key and drove to the old bank branch my grandmother had made me memorize. It was in an older part of town, the kind of branch that had not been renovated into sleek glass and fake friendliness. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, carpet that remembered every decade badly. I carried the letter in my bag and kept touching it like it might disappear if I stopped. The safe deposit process took longer than I wanted. Identity verification. Signature comparison. A manager who asked polite questions in a tone that suggested people inherit trouble more often than money. Then they brought out the box. It was smaller than I expected. That should have calmed me. It did not. Inside were documents neatly bound in labeled folders. A flash drive, a small digital recorder, a sealed notarized statement, handwritten notes in Grandma's precise script, copies of account histories, property documents, trust papers, medical records, appointment logs. Not chaos. A case. That is when I knew this had gone far beyond family ugliness. Grandma had not hidden keepsakes. She had built a trail. I started with the trust documents because they had sticky tabs on them. Her handwriting marked the key pages. The structure was complicated enough that I will not pretend I understood every detail in that bank room, but I understood enough. The money Hoang thought he had inherited outright was tied to a long protected arrangement that preserved it for me at 25. Grandma had been the caretaker, not the final owner in the way everyone assumed. The house situation was more layered, but the essential point was brutal and simple. Hoang had spent the last few months pressuring an old woman for access to something he did not fully understand, and did not legally own the way he believed he did. I moved to the financial statements next. That was where the picture got uglier. Credit lines, transfers, short-term borrowing, payments to gambling platforms, overdue notices, gaps, scrambling, amounts that were too large to excuse as bad budgeting and too reckless to mistake for normal debt. Hoang was not thriving. He was drowning. And then there was a folder labeled with a name I did not recognize. Lin. At first I thought maybe it was an accountant or advisor. Then I saw lease records, transfer patterns, hotel receipts, gifts and messages printed out in sequence. Not an advisor. A second life. A woman he had been funding while telling my parents he was just between deals. I sat back in the bank chair and actually laughed once. Not because any of it was funny. Because it was so perfectly him. He had spent years posturing as the son who would carry the family forward, while quietly building a collapse underneath himself. And everyone around him had kept calling it ambition because ambition sounds better than appetite. Then I found the recorder. Grandma had labeled it in black pen if needed. My pulse actually kicked when I turned it on. The first file was just room tone for a few seconds. Then my grandmother's voice. Steady, not confused, not slurred. Date, she said clearly, and named it. Then there was movement, a chair scraping, and Hoang's voice. I knew his voice well enough to hear the version of him in that recording immediately. This was not the polished family version. Not the charming relative version. Not the big brother act he wore around older aunties. This was the impatient, stripped-down version. The one that appeared when he believed the other person had no leverage. He asked if the papers were ready. Grandma told him no. He said he was done waiting. He said everyone already knew the money should stay with him because he was the eldest, the son, the one who could do something meaningful with it. Grandma said she was not signing anything else that day. Then his tone changed. Colder. He said, "You don't need to play games with me. Once this is done, I'm selling the place anyway." There was a pause. Then he said the sentence that still turns my stomach. "I'm not spending the rest of my life babysitting old people. Mom and Dad can go to whatever cheap home takes them. You know how many places there are if you don't care what they smell like." I actually shut my eyes. He kept going. He said the money was his. That he deserved a life that looked like something. That he was tired of carrying dead weight. Then he named me. He said if I started asking questions he had ways to deal with me too. He said people already believed I was emotional, tired, too attached. It would not be hard to push the story a little further. He talked about consultations, evaluations, making me look unstable if that was what it took. At one point my grandmother said very quietly, "She is the only one here who has loved this family without taking from it," and Hoang answered, "Then that makes her the easiest one to bury under paperwork." That was the moment I stopped seeing him as just the spoiled son my parents had overindulged. That was a predator's sentence. That was the moment my grief burned clean into something else. When the recording ended, I sat frozen in that bank room with my hand over my mouth. The manager knocked once before opening the door a crack to ask if I needed more time. I must have looked strange because his face changed when he saw me. I said yes. He closed the door again. I listened to the file twice more. Not because I doubted what I had heard. Because part of me needed to understand the scale of it. Hoang had not just manipulated my parents. He had cornered a dying woman. He had calculated around her illness. He had looked at my years of unpaid care, my patience, my visible grief, and decided it made me easier to erase. That was the real betrayal. Not just taking what was not his. Trying to turn love itself into weakness. By the time I left the bank, I had stopped feeling like the girl who walked out of my parents' house holding a coat and trying not to beg for scraps of dignity. I was not healed. I was not calm. But I was no longer confused. And confusion is what keeps people like Hoang powerful. Clarity changes the room. Over the next 2 nights I went through every single piece in the safe deposit box. My apartment turned into a war table. Documents spread across the kitchen. Grandma's notes beside my laptop. Receipts, timelines, records, and my own memories lining up in ways that made the past suddenly make terrible sense. There were medical evaluations showing Grandma remained competent longer than Hoang wanted people to believe. There were handwritten logs of his visits. Dates, times, topics. Her notes about pressure. Her notes about what he asked. Her notes about when he tried to isolate her from other people in the room. There was even a separate envelope with copies of older estate instructions and annotations showing why the public will was only one layer of what governed the assets. She had anticipated denial. She had anticipated panic. She had anticipated that people who relied on noise would try to drown out paper. So she had built redundancy. Documents, witnesses, audio, dates, professional corroboration. And woven through all of it were her short notes to me. Don't rush. He will brag. He needs an audience more than he needs caution. He will expose himself if he thinks the room belongs to him. One note was tucked into the folder with the notary information. When he smiles for the room, end it. I read that one 3 times. That was when I understood the truth I had not fully let myself face yet. Grandma had not only gathered evidence, she had designed sequence. She did not just want the transfer blocked. She wanted Hoang to commit himself publicly. She wanted him standing tall in front of witnesses talking like an owner reaching for something that was never his. Because greed is always clearest at the moment it thinks it no longer has to hide. That section of the week should have felt empowering. It did not. Not exactly. It felt sickening. Because every new layer of protection my grandmother had built also told me how afraid she had been, how carefully she had to think. How often she must have watched Hoang come into that room and calculate what he could take from an old woman before anyone noticed. I slept badly. I kept hearing the recording. Not the whole thing. Just fragments. Cheap home. Dead weight. Easy to bury under paperwork. That line about me kept finding me. It hit some old bruise I had not named. Because he was not wrong about one part of it. Not about me. About the family. He understood something ugly and accurate. In a house where one child is always translated generously, and the other one is always asked to explain herself, it does not take much to push the second child into silence. They have been trained for it. That realization dropped me lower than the will reading had. The will reading hurt. This was colder. This was learning that the structure that diminished me had become useful to someone dangerous. I spent one whole night sitting on my kitchen floor, with the recorder beside me, and the coat hanging from a chair, thinking about my grandmother pretending to go cold, just to keep me alive and unexposed, long enough for the trap to work. That was the bottom for me. Not the loss. The cost. The fact that the last way she loved me had to look like rejection. People romanticize family protection. They picture speeches. Sacrifice with swelling music. Real protection is often uglier. It can look like distance. It can look like one person carrying the misunderstanding, so another person survives long enough to learn the truth. At 3 in the morning, I stood up, walked to the coat, touched the place where the stitching had been, and said out loud, "I get it now." The room obviously said nothing back. But something in me shifted again. The pain was still there. It just stopped running the show. The next morning I made a list. Not a revenge list. A sequence list. What had to be verified? What could be copied? Who needed to be contacted? What could not be said too soon? What absolutely had to happen in the right order? That matters more than people think. Because once you have evidence, the temptation is to explode. To call. To accuse. To storm into the room and force truth into daylight. But truth mishandled can still get buried. Grandma knew that. So I forced myself to slow down. I checked the trust papers first with someone I trusted to read them correctly. Not a family friend. Not anyone who knew my parents. A private estate litigator whose card was tucked into Grandma's box with 2 words written on the back. Quiet, reliable. I called her office and got an appointment the next afternoon. Her name was Rachel Bell, and she had the kind of office that made you understand immediately. She was expensive because she had earned the right to be calm. No fake friendliness. No unnecessary sympathy. Just precision. I brought copies, not originals. That was Grandma too. Rachel spent 40 minutes reading without interruption. Then she looked up at me and said, "Your grandmother was very careful." I nearly cried from relief right there. Instead I asked, "Do I have enough?" She leaned back in her chair. Enough for what? That was such a lawyer question. It almost made me smile. To stop him. She tapped the trust papers once. To stop him, yes. To destroy any clean narrative he has about rightful inheritance, also yes. To make the consequences stick, timing matters. Then she asked for the full story. I gave it to her. Not theatrically. Just the facts. The will reading. The coat. The letter. The safe deposit box. The debts. The recording. My parents' role in enabling him. The months of pressure around Grandma's illness. Rachel listened all the way through. When I finished, she said, "Do not contact your brother. Do not warn your parents. Do not tell anyone what you found. If he is planning a formal transfer or public celebration, let him continue." I said, "So we let him walk?" She met my eyes and said, "We let him step where the floor gives way." That line stayed with me. We spent the next week building a case that could hold in daylight. She had her team verify the trust chain. She reviewed the notarized statement Grandma left. She flagged which documents mattered most if challenged quickly in a room full of people trying to deny what they were hearing. She also said something I had not fully appreciated yet. Evidence is strongest when it overlaps, she told me. Paper is good. Audio is good. Witnesses are good. Competence records are good. But when paper, audio, dates, and human testimony line up, people have fewer places to run. So we built overlap. Rachel's office contacted the bank to verify chain of custody and access records. We secured certified copies where needed. We reviewed Grandma's medical evaluations for the question everyone like Hoang eventually raises. Was she competent? That piece mattered, because men like him never stop at greed. Once confronted, they always retreat into insult. Confused old woman, emotional granddaughter, family misunderstanding. He would need the facts to blur. So we took away the blur. One of the nurses who had seen him in Grandma's room agreed to provide a statement. She remembered him pressing for signatures when Grandma was visibly tired. She remembered his tone changing when he thought staff had stepped far enough away not to hear clearly. Then there was a building staff member from Grandma's assisted living wing during her final month who remembered Hoang asking which day's paperwork could be handled without too many interruptions. At the time it sounded like impatience. In context it looked different. Every piece tightened something. And every piece also hurt. Because none of it existed without reason. There is no good version of being the person who inherits proof of what someone was willing to do to a dying woman. During that same week, my parents started calling more. Not to apologize. Not to ask how I was doing. To manage me. My mother's first message said, "Don't be dramatic about the will. Your grandmother knew what she was doing." My father's said, "It would be best for everyone if you didn't stir things up now that arrangements are being made." Arrangements. That word almost impressed me. The nerve of it. They still thought I was the potential problem. Not the son racing toward money he did not own. Me. That is another thing toxic families do. They train you to become the imagined source of instability so thoroughly that even when someone else is committing the actual harm, everyone still looks to you and says, "Don't make this worse." I stopped replying. That was new for me. Silence had always been something done to me. Now it became something I used. A few days later, Hoang texted, "Hope you're enjoying the coat." Then, a minute later, "Don't embarrass yourself by showing up when we finalize things." Finalize things. He still thought the performance was already done. I stared at that message for a long time. Not because it hurt. Not in the same way it would have before. Because it told me something useful. He was overconfident enough to taunt me while walking toward paperwork. That meant Grandma had judged him perfectly. I sent nothing back. Instead, I forwarded the message to Rachel. She responded with one sentence. "Good. Let him keep talking like that." If you have ever been invited back into a room only because the people inside believed they had already erased you, you already know the question I had to answer next. Do you warn them, or do you let them keep smiling until the truth lands? A week and a half after the will reading, the invitation came. Not formally mailed. Not because they wanted me there. My aunt texted me a photo of the setup my mother was bragging about. Catered lunch, flowers, champagne. And the notary coming to help Hoang step into his new responsibility. My aunt meant well, she did not know. But the second I saw the picture, I understood exactly what was happening. He was not content to take the win quietly. He needed witnesses. He needed to be seen becoming the man he had been pretending to be for years. That vanity was going to break him. The night before the signing, I took Grandma's coat to a seamstress 2 blocks from my apartment. Older woman. No nonsense. Someone I had used once before to fix a hem. I asked if she could clean it, repair the opened lining invisibly, and reshape it slightly so it sat better on my frame. She looked at the coat, then at me, and said, "You need it tomorrow." I said yes. She took one look at my face, and did not ask why. The next afternoon I picked it up. It still looked like Grandma's coat, but it sat differently now. Stronger shoulders, cleaner line, the same fabric, the same history. But no longer hanging on me like grief. When I put it on in her shop and looked in the mirror, I did not think I looked powerful. I thought I looked exact. That mattered more. Back in my apartment, I laid out everything in the order Rachel and I had discussed. Summary documents first. The key trust pages. Grandma's recorded declaration of competence. The timeline. Then the audio. Not first. Never first. Because when you lead with the most emotional piece, people think the rest is built around feeling. I needed the room pinned before I broke it open. That night I barely slept. I kept rehearsing what not to do. Do not argue like the old version of you. Do not defend your goodness to people who used it against you. Do not waste time begging for recognition from a crowd committed to the wrong story. Let the documents move first. Let him talk. Let him believe the room still belongs to him. I got dressed slowly the next morning. Black trousers, cream blouse, Grandma's coat. Minimal makeup, because I did not want armor that could be called performance. I wanted them to see the same woman they had dismissed, just no longer available for it. When I was about to leave, my phone buzzed. My mother. I let it ring out. Then another message came through. "Don't come today. This isn't about you." I looked at that sentence for a long time. Then I smiled for the first time since the funeral. Because she was right in one narrow way. It was not about me anymore. It was about what happens when a family builds itself around denial, so completely that the wrong person starts thinking the law will bend to the same lie. I drove to the house without music. No speeches in my head. No fantasy lines. Just the route. The stoplights. The coat against my shoulders. The file case in the passenger seat. Halfway there, I heard Grandma's voice in memory. People show you who they are when they think you can't do anything with the information. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the cars were already lined up along the curb. My mother had put flower arrangements outside. Of course she had. Nothing says moral rot like good staging. I sat behind the wheel for a few extra seconds with both hands resting on the file case. Then I got out. If you had been in my place walking back into the house that threw you out, would you have done it? Would you have stepped back into that room and let the people who erased you look right at what survived anyway? The front door was open. I could hear voices, dishes, fake laughter. The living room had been rearranged. Chairs set in a loose semicircle. A folding table near the center, with documents already stacked. Champagne flutes waiting on a sideboard like this was a promotion party instead of a theft dressed up as family honor. My mother saw me first. Her entire face changed. Not guilt. Alarm. "Why are you here?" she said immediately too loudly. That got everyone's attention. Hoang turned from the table with a glass in his hand and actually smiled when he saw me like I had shown up to entertain him. "I told you not to embarrass yourself," he said. I closed the door behind me and took in the room. My father near the window again. Same position as the will reading. 2 aunts. My cousin, the notary at the table organizing papers. A family friend pretending not to enjoy the spectacle. And Hoang center stage wearing a navy suit like he was about to accept an award for a life he had not lived. He looked me over slowly. His eyes paused on the coat. And for just a second I saw something flicker there. Recognition maybe. Not of the coat itself. Of the fact that I had not arrived looking broken. That mattered to him. Men like Hoang need your damage visible. If it is not, they start feeling less certain about the room. My mother walked toward me and lowered her voice badly enough that everyone could still hear. "This is not the time." I said, "You're right." Then I stepped past her. The room got quieter. Hoang laughed once and set his glass down. "What are you here to contest the will now?" "A little late for that." "No," I said. "I'm here because you're about to sign for something that isn't yours." That landed. Not fully, but enough to change the air. My father straightened. It was the warning tone. The one from childhood. The one meant to make me shrink before I had even said the important part. It did not work anymore. The notary looked up from the papers, cautious now. Hoang stepped closer with that dangerous half-smile he used when he thought he could bully a situation back into shape. "You really want to do this in front of everyone?" I looked at him and said, "You're the one who wanted everyone here." That was the first crack. Small but visible, because it reminded the room of something simple. This stage was his choice. He shrugged and spread his arms, a little performing ease. "Fine, say what you came to say." I did not answer immediately. That pause was deliberate. I wanted him to keep filling space. Wanted him to hear himself. My mother tried again. Stop being dramatic. The documents have already been reviewed." That was when Rachel stepped in from the hallway. She had arrived through the side entrance exactly when planned, carrying a slim leather portfolio, and the kind of expression that makes weak people instantly defensive, because it leaves nowhere for chaos to stick. I watched Hoang's face change. Just a little. He had not expected me to bring someone like that. Rachel introduced herself to the notary, first not to my family, also deliberate, professional before personal. Then she said, "Before any further representation is made regarding beneficial ownership or transfer rights, there are material documents this room needs to see." The notary went still. Huang's whole body tightened. "What is this?" Rachel ignored the emotion in his voice and placed the first set of documents on the table. Trust summary. Chain of stewardship. Relevant supporting pages. Grandma's recorded declaration of competence. Certified copies. The notary took one look and stopped touching his pen. My mother looked between them, annoyed first, then confused. My father said, "There must be some misunderstanding." Rachel finally turned to him. "There is, but not on our side." Hoang let out a short laugh that did not sound real. "This is insane. Grandma left me the house and accounts. Everybody heard it." I said, "You heard what she wanted you to hear in that room." He snapped his eyes to me. There it was. The first moment he understood this might be bigger than a sulking sister with hurt feelings. His voice went hard. You think you can show up with random papers and stop this? No, I said. I know I can. Rachel slid another document toward the notary and said, "The public will does not operate the way Mr. Tran has been representing it today. If he proceeds after being made aware of the controlling asset structure, that creates a very different situation." The notary removed his glasses, read again, then looked directly at Hoang. That was the second crack, because suddenly the room no longer treated him like the man at the center of an event. It treated him like a question. My mother turned to me, furious now. "What did you do?" That line almost made me laugh. All my life, whenever the truth showed up inconveniently, my family's first instinct was to accuse the person carrying it. I looked at her and said I opened the only thing Grandma trusted me to take. The coat. I watched the sentence move through the room. One aunt glanced at the coat on my shoulders. The family friend looked down. My father's face drained a little. He was slower than my mother, but when recognition finally reached him, it hit harder. Hoang tried to bulldoze past the shift. "This is all technical nonsense. The intent is obvious." That was when I stepped closer to the table and said the line I had been carrying for days. "No, Hoang. Your greed was obvious. The intent was hidden from you on purpose." That was the first true mic drop in the room. Not because it was flashy, because it was accurate enough to silence people. I laid Grandma's letter on the table, but I did not push it toward him. It was not for him. It was for the notary and for the room. Rachel summarized its evidentiary role, not its emotional role. Again, deliberate. Keep the structure clean. Huang's face had lost the easy color it came with. He turned to my parents. "Are you really going to stand here and let her do this?" My mother seized on the question, like panic always needed someone lower in the hierarchy to stand on. She said, "Whatever you're upset about, this is not the way. We can talk privately. So they could minimize it, delay it, pressure it, rename it." I looked at her and said, "You only want privacy now because the truth sounds different when other people can hear it." That landed too. My father stepped in, voice low and forceful. "Enough. Whatever legal confusion there is, this doesn't justify humiliating your brother." I turned to him so slowly, it made him uncomfortable. "Humiliating him," I said. "He invited witnesses to a theft." For the first time in my life, my father had no immediate answer. The notary cleared his throat and said carefully, "I'm not proceeding until all of this is reviewed in full." That should have been enough to stop the room. But Hoang had built his whole personality around never accepting the first closed door. He slammed his hand flat against the table. "You can't do this," he said, now looking at me like rage might still restore his balance. "You think some old records change the fact that Grandma wanted me in charge." There it was. The angle Rachel had predicted. Not law. Dominion. He still thought the world worked like my parents' house. If he said ownership loudly enough, people would rearrange around it. Rachel said, "Mr. Tran, I suggest you stop speaking until counsel is present." He laughed bitterly. "Oh, now I need counsel for my own inheritance." And I said, "Not for your inheritance, for what you tried to do with mine." Silence. Total this time. Even the room knew that sentence had crossed them into somewhere they could not pretend was still ordinary family conflict. Huang looked at me like he wanted to deny it, insult it, crush it all at once. But I could see calculation finally entering where arrogance had been. He was trying to guess how much I had. The answer he did not know yet was enough. He said, quieter now, "What exactly do you think you can prove?" I looked at him for one beat too long. Then I said, "You're right. The documents stop the lie. They don't show everything." I opened my file case and took out the recorder. His face changed before anyone else understood why. That was when I knew. Not hoped. Knew. He remembered exactly what he had said to my grandmother. "If you had been me in that room once, the money was safe and the paperwork had stopped, would you have ended it there, or would you have made everyone hear who he really was, when he thought only a dying woman was listening?" I placed the recorder on the table between the champagne glasses and the transfer papers. That visual alone was enough to make my mother's hand fly to her chest. Hoang moved first. Fast. Too fast. He reached toward it and Rachel stepped between us before he got close enough to touch it. "Don't," she said. The force in her voice made even him stop. He looked around the room, searching for control, and found none. I pressed play. At first there was only static and the scrape of fabric. Then Grandma's voice, clear, dated, steady, not confused, not manipulated, not wandering. Every person in that room knew her voice. That mattered more than anything I could have said. Then came Hoang's. Flat, impatient, demanding. He spoke about the papers, about waiting, about how things should already be his. My mother looked at him once quickly, then away again, like if she did not fully hear it, maybe she could still protect him. Then the recording moved forward. His voice sharpened. He talked about selling the house. He talked about not wasting his life on old people. Then he said it. That if our parents complained too much, he could dump them in some cheap place that would take them. The room actually recoiled. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not a word. Just a small, broken sound. My father stood totally still. And Hoang, my brilliant brother, my parents' investment, the family's chosen future, looked suddenly like a man who had not prepared for his own voice to become evidence. The recording kept going. His comments about money, about dead weight, about how easy it would be to bury me under paperwork because people already thought I was too emotional. That one hit the room differently. Not because they cared more about me all at once. Because it exposed the structure they had all helped build. He knew he could use that story, because they had handed it to him. Grandma's voice came through once more, quiet but unshaken. She said I was the only one there who had loved the family without taking from it. Then Hoang answered with that line about me being the easiest one to bury. When the recording ended, nobody moved. The notary sat back in his chair like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. My aunt started crying first. Not from loyalty to me, I think. From the shock of hearing what greed sounds like when it finally stops trying to be charming. My mother whispered, Hoang. Just his name. Nothing else. Because what do you say in that moment? What language is left when the son you defended for decades starts speaking about you like furniture he plans to dump somewhere cheap? Puang recovered badly. That is the thing about people who are used to being rescued by narrative. When narrative fails, they become clumsy fast. He said she baited me. She knew she was recording. She twisted the conversation. Rachel answered before I had to. Thank you, she said. He stared at her. For what? For confirming you recognized the conversation. That was another clean hit. Because denial had just become admission with different clothes on. His head snapped toward me. You planned this. And I said no. Grandma did. You just kept doing exactly what she knew you would. My father finally found his voice then. Is this true? It would have been comical if it were not so pathetic. He was asking his son if the son's own voice was true. Hoang looked at him and tried the only move he had left. Blame up, blame down, blame sideways. She turned you all against me, he said, pointing at me now. She's always been jealous. Grandma filled her head with nonsense. You know how she is. She keeps receipts. She keeps every little slight like it means something. For one brief second I almost felt something like gratitude. Because even in collapse he kept telling the truth sideways. Yes. I kept receipts. Because somebody in that family had to live in reality. Rachel laid out the remaining pieces with ruthless calm. The nursing statements. The competence records. The trust chain. The timeline of pressure. The financial history showing his debt exposure. The notary documents indicating that any continued representation of ownership after notice would deepen legal jeopardy. Everything overlapped. Everything pointed the same direction. This was no sister's tantrum. No misunderstanding. No family argument inflated by grief. It was a documented attempt by a desperate man to seize control of assets he believed a dying woman was too isolated to protect. The family friend quietly left the room. One aunt followed. The spectacle had stopped being entertaining. Now it smelled like liability. Hoang tried one last turn toward my mother. Mom, say something. She did, but not what he wanted. She looked at him like she had never seen his face clearly before, and said, You said that about us. He opened his mouth, closed it. That was the closest I would ever see him come to shame. Not guilt, not remorse. Just the shock of discovering that even he might not be able to talk his way out once the performance was stripped off. My father sat down without seeming to realize he had done it. He looked older in that moment than he had at Grandma's funeral. Not because truth had suddenly made him noble, because denial takes energy, and he was finally running out of it. Then the next part began. Rachel had already prepared for this. Once the attempted transfer crossed into explicit representation after notice, the issue was no longer something my family could solve. By lowering voices and asking for time, calls had been made, guidance had been taken. The people who needed to be ready were ready. I will not dramatize the arrival more than it deserves. No one burst in like a TV show. No handcuffs in slow motion. Just consequences, showing up with names, timing, and paperwork. And for the first time in his life, Hoang could not glare his way past them. He started bargaining immediately, then minimizing, then attacking me again, then saying everyone misunderstood, then demanding privacy, then insisting this was all a family matter. That phrase nearly made me laugh. Family matter. As if that had not been the cover story protecting him for years. As if the whole reason he got this far was not because my parents treated every warning sign as something to be handled inside the house where the wrong people kept winning. He looked at me once while the room was breaking around him, and said with pure hatred, "You really did this?" And I said no. "You did this in the moment you thought no one could stop you." That was the last time I answered him. Because by then he no longer mattered as a speaker. Only as evidence. If you are listening to this and thinking the hardest part must have been exposing him, it was not. The hardest part came after when the room turned, and the people who had spent a lifetime teaching me not to expect fairness suddenly looked at me like I was the last stable surface left. That was when my mother started crying in a way I had never seen. Real crying. Not social crying. Not grief theater. Humiliation crying. Shock crying. The crying of a woman hearing all at once both what her son thought of her, and what her daughter had been trying not to say for years. She took a step toward me. I took one back. That hurt her. I could see that it hurt her. And a year earlier, even a month earlier, I might have moved toward that pain. I might have tried to soothe it, translate it, make it manageable so the family could keep functioning. But that is how people like me get trapped. We mistake access to our empathy for a right. My mother said I didn't know. That sentence lit something cold in me. Because maybe she did not know everything. But she had known enough. She had known who showed up. Who cleaned up. Who was easy to blame. Who was expensive to disappoint. Who was safe to dismiss. She had known enough to choose convenience over truth for years. I looked at her and said, "You didn't want to know." That one almost knocked her backward more than the recording did. My father stood then shaky, and came closer than he had been to me in months. He said, and his voice cracked on my name for the first time in my adult life. "We made mistakes. Mistakes. There are words people use when they need wrongdoing to shrink enough to survive it." I said, "You made a pattern." He closed his eyes. Because that was harder to defend. Mistakes sound accidental. A pattern means choice repeated until it becomes architecture. That was the real story of my family. Not one ugly afternoon. Architecture. Built one excuse at a time. The room thinned out after that. Some people left because they were uncomfortable. Some because they were embarrassed to have witnessed the wrong kind of truth. Some because scandal is fun until it starts sounding like your own relatives. I stayed until Rachel told me there was nothing else I needed to say. Before leaving, I looked once more at the folding table in the center of the room, the champagne, the half-signed papers, the recorder, Grandma's letter. The entire fantasy collapsed into paper and silence. That image still satisfies something in me. Not because I enjoy ruin. Because I know how rarely people like Hoang are forced to meet consequences in the exact room where they expected applause. If you think that kind of proof automatically heals a family, it does not. It just removes the last excuse. After that, what remains is choice. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. No dramatic reconciliation. No perfect speech from my father. No beautiful maternal awakening. Just fallout. Hoang faced what he had earned. Investigations. Legal exposure. Debt without the inheritance he had banked on. And the collapse of the polished story he had used to move through the world. My parents lost the future they had already started spending in their heads. That part showed up fast. The calls changed tone within 48 hours. My mother's first voicemail after the confrontation was all tears and broken phrases. Family. Shock. Please call me. We need to talk. My father texted, come by when you can. We need to discuss what happens next. Not, how are you not? We're sorry. What happens next? Even then, reflex came before remorse. I ignored them for 2 days. Not as punishment. As oxygen. I needed 2 full days in my own apartment with no voices from that house entering my body. I slept. I cleaned. I put the documents back into organized boxes. I met Rachel once more to confirm the next steps I needed to take, and the ones I did not. And then on the 3rd day I went back to my apartment, made tea, sat at my kitchen table, and listened to the silence long enough to realize something I had not let myself imagine before. The story was over. Not legally. Not fully. But emotionally the chase was over. I did not need their recognition anymore to verify what had happened. That sounds simple when people say it after they have healed. It does not feel simple when it arrives. It feels strangely empty at first. Like discovering you have been pressing against a locked door for years, and now finally you do not need what is on the other side. That evening my parents came to my apartment anyway. My building buzzer startled me. When I looked through the security camera and saw them standing downstairs, older somehow, smaller somehow, I almost did not answer. But I did. Not because I owed them access. Because I wanted to hear what regret sounds like when it has nowhere left to hide. I let them up. My mother walked in first and looked around like she had never really pictured where I lived. Which, to be fair, she probably had not. Not truly. She had asked for my address before, of course. For packages. For forms. For convenience. Not out of real curiosity about my life. My father stayed near the door with his hands clasped in front of him as if he were in someone else's office. Nobody sat until I did. That was new too. My mother began crying almost immediately. I don't know how to fix this, she said. That line might have softened me years ago. Now it just sounded late. I said, you can't. She cried harder at that, but I did not look away. My father said, we were wrong about your brother. I nodded once. Yes, I said. You were. Then I waited. Because the important thing was whether they would stop there, stop at the son, stop at the obvious villain, or whether they would ever step far enough into honesty to include themselves. My mother did first. Not gracefully, not all at once, but enough. She said, we thought you were stronger. We thought you didn't need as much. We thought he needed more help. I said, so you helped him become dangerous. Her mouth opened and closed. My father exhaled through his nose and sat down heavily. We didn't see it, he said. And again that word. See. As if sight had failed them. As if this were weather. I looked at both of them, and said, you saw what was easy to live with. That was the truth of it. I was not invisible. I was simply less expensive to ignore. My mother reached for the tissue box on my table, and started apologizing in fragments. For the hospital. For the will reading. For not defending me. For believing the version of me that kept the peace instead of the version of me that was telling the truth. It was the closest thing to honest I had ever heard from her. And it still did not change the shape of what had been done. Because apologies matter, but timing matters too. There is a kind of apology that only arrives after consequences make denial uncomfortable. That apology may still contain real pain. It may even contain some real self-knowledge. But it does not erase the years before it. My father asked, can we make this right? I looked around my apartment then, at the chip table, the second-hand lamp, the coat hanging carefully by the door, the life I had built in small, exhausted pieces while they kept waiting for Hoang to become the son they wanted. And I realized what they still did not understand. They thought rightness meant restoration. A repaired version of the old arrangement. But there was no old arrangement worth repairing. So I told them the truth as clearly as I knew how. You don't get to come to me now, because the son you chose turned on you, and decide I'm family again, because I'm useful. That's not love, that's rearrangement. My mother cried harder. My father's shoulders dropped. I kept going because I had spent enough of my life stopping before the part that mattered. You want to know when forgiveness died, I said. It didn't die at the will reading. It died the day you watched me carry your mother through her worst months, and still found it easy to treat me like I was asking for too much just by standing in the room. Neither of them interrupted. Good. They needed to hear it whole. I was the easy child to disappoint, I said. The easy child to delay. The easy child to explain away. Hoang didn't invent that. He used it. He learned it here. That sentence broke something open in my father's face. I think for the first time, he actually saw the line from their parenting to my brother's entitlement not as coincidence but as inheritance. My mother whispered, "Please don't cut us off." And there it was. The real fear. Not what Hoang had done. Not what they had done. Abandonment. The thing they had trained me on for years without calling it by name. I sat back and looked at them for a long moment. It would be very convenient for everyone except me. If this were the part of the story where I said, blood is blood, people make mistakes, pain taught us all something, and now we would move forward carefully, but together. That is the ending families like mine always want. Not because it is moral, because it restores access without requiring full payment. But I had not fought this hard to crawl back into the same machine with better language around it. So I said no, not cruelly. Not dramatically. Just cleanly. I'm not doing this anymore. My mother shook her head. I'm serious, I said. I'm not carrying this family anymore. I'm not translating your regret into redemption. I'm not becoming the safe child again just because the unsafe one finally showed you his face. My father's eyes were wet by then, though he tried to hide it. He said, "You're all we have left." That line was supposed to move me. Maybe in another life it would have. But in that moment it only proved how little they understood. I said, "No. I was who you had all along." That was the last important thing I ever said to them in my apartment. My mother cried for another few minutes. My father asked if I was sure. I said yes. Then I walked them to the door. At the threshold my mother turned like she wanted one more opening, one more softer version. I did not give it to her. Not because I hated her. Because mercy without boundary had nearly ruined my life. When I closed the door behind them I expected to collapse. I did not. I stood there with my hands still on the knob and felt something strange. Not happiness. Space. That was the beginning of healing for me. Not warmth, not reunion. Space where fear used to live. In the months that followed, I did something my family had never imagined I could do. Because they had trained themselves never to look closely at the disciplines that kept me alive. I built quietly. Not a glamorous empire. Not a revenge fantasy. A life. The money Grandma had protected gave me room I had never had before, but room only matters if you know what to do with it. And because of her I did. I paid off what needed paying. I moved out of the apartment over the nail salon. I rented a small storefront in a neighborhood that still felt reachable to real people. And I opened a studio built around restoration. Clothing repair. Alterations. Small custom work. Vintage restoration. Quiet craftsmanship. The kind of business built on patience, precision, and the belief that what other people dismiss often still has structure worth saving. People assumed the idea came from the coat. They were not wrong. But it came from more than that. It came from Grandma teaching me that mending is not denial. It is evidence that damage happened and care happened after. That became the whole philosophy of the place. Nothing hidden badly. Nothing smoothed over so completely that history disappears. Just work honest enough to let something continue without pretending it was never torn. I named the studio Brown Thread. Not after the coat exactly. After the seam. The hidden seam. The thing nobody noticed because they thought the object had no value. The thing that held the truth. On the morning we opened I wore Grandma's coat. Not as costume, not as grief. Just because it belonged there. The seamstress had done beautiful work. Clean lines. Strong shoulders. The coat still looked like itself, but it no longer carried the weight of being mistaken for rejection. Customers started coming in slowly, then steadily. Mothers with dresses that needed taking in. Men with jackets inherited from fathers they did not know how to let go of. Young women bringing in vintage pieces and asking whether they could be made wearable again without losing what made them special. Every time I said yes, I felt something in me answer too. My parents wrote more than once in those first months. Long messages, apologies, updates about court proceedings, fragments about how empty the house felt now. I did not respond. That is the part people judge most harshly when they hear my story. Not the exposure. Not the confrontation. The silence after. As if silence is crueler than years of being made small. As if I owed them proximity because they finally understood what it cost me to love them. But boundaries are not cruelty. Sometimes they are the first honest language a family has ever been forced to hear. The last time I saw either of them was nearly 8 months later. Not planned. I was leaving the studio one evening locking up when I looked across the street and saw my father sitting alone on a bench outside a pharmacy. He looked older, smaller, real maybe in a way he had never allowed himself to be, when he still had a household to rule and a son to believe in. He saw me too. We held each other's gaze across traffic for a second. Then he stood. I thought he might come over. He did not. He just gave one small nod. Not permission. Not ownership. Not a father claiming anything. More like acknowledgement. Of what exactly I cannot say. Maybe of the life I had built. Maybe of the fact that I had done it without them. Maybe of the part he could no longer deny. That the daughter they trained themselves to underestimate had been the only one in that family strong enough to survive the truth, without turning rotten under it. I nodded back once. Then I got into my car and drove home. That was enough. People love endings where the damaged family learns something beautiful and gathers again in softer light. That was never going to be my ending. My ending was simpler. I stopped begging to be chosen by people who only valued me when my pain became useful to them. I stopped calling endurance love. I stopped confusing access with belonging. And I learned that sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for the part of yourself that survived is refuse to hand it back to the people who taught you it was disposable. Every now and then, usually on colder mornings, I run my fingers over the inside of Grandma's coat where the hidden stitches used to be. You cannot see the repair now unless you know exactly where to look. I do. That feels right. Because that is what the whole story was really. A hidden seam. A family certain they understood value. A woman everyone underestimated because she was quiet. A dying grandmother, who saw greed clearly enough to design its ending. And one old coat that carried more truth than everybody in that house put together. If Hoang were in your family, what would be the one line you would never forgive? If you grew up as the child who was always expected to understand, endure, and ask for less, tell me the one word that describes how that felt. And tell me this too. When parents only see the truth after it costs them everything, do they deserve forgiveness? Or does survival sometimes look like walking away for good? I know my answer. I wear it every winter.